Hi friends, Max Elhash here. On this episode of the Corpus Animus podcast, I have training think tank coach Evan Peikon on, and we discuss hypertrophy. So get your listen on and figure out how to get jacked. If you're on the go and you want to listen to just the audio version, subscribe to the Corpus Animus podcast on your favorite podcast app. Learn more about the art and science of program design for CrossFit in our online educational platform, The Classroom. Get a free 7-day trial at trainingthinktank.com/classroom trial.
So yeah, I think any discussion about hypertrophy training, it probably makes sense to talk about what is hypertrophy, because it's actually not abundantly clear what hypertrophy is. You'd think, oh, your muscles are getting bigger, but that's not even necessarily true in all cases. Hypertrophy is really a non-specific adaptation, so it could be changes to your connective tissue. It could be that you're storing more fuel inside the muscle, and all of that is going to manifest as your muscle looking bigger, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your muscle's even grown. And then when we get into muscle growth, you'd think that we have that pretty well nailed down, but all we really know is that the muscle's changing in either mass or volume. But anything more than that starts to get into some kind of like sketchy waters, where is the length of a muscle fiber getting longer? Is it widening? Are we getting more muscle fibers? Or things that we still don't really know?
Yeah, you think that's why some people get jacked and put on a bunch of muscle, but they don't really get stronger. Some people get a lot stronger, but don't really put on muscle, but they look like they're kind of just denser, probably the way to describe it.
Yeah, that would be one way to describe it. Then we also have to think about, well, how is hypothetically, if your muscle is even growing, how is it growing? Are the muscle fibers, the fascicles getting longer? Which if you think about your insertion point of your muscle, it's not going to move. Your bicep insertion is not moving 2 inches up or down.
Yeah.
So if a muscle fiber that's inserting here and here is getting longer, then the muscle's going to have to bow out more.
It's going to bow more. Yeah.
Versus if the fascicle's getting wider, so the length of the muscle staying the same, but it's just widening out, those are going to have different functional changes. So it's going to influence the properties of the muscle differently, how the muscle's going to insert, how it's going to influence the ability for oxygen to get into the muscle. All of those things are going to be...
Man, just back in the day, it wasn't this complicated. It was like, do sets of 10 to 12 heavy, rest short, and you'll get bigger.
Yes, I think the petition that we need to make is to stop talking about hypertrophy, and it's just saying, how do we get muscles more bigger? Because
that's fair enough.
Whether you get stronger or whether the muscular endurance improves, none of that even matters. It's just, how do we get it more bigger? And we know how to do that.
Okay, so how do we do that?
So obviously, on the simplest level, we're going to do resistance training approximately to failure on a work set per work set basis. So I think the nuance kind of comes in, what intensity do we need to train in to stimulate muscle growth? So there's going to be an effective intensity range. Within that intensity range, how much volume do you need to do on a per muscle basis?
Yeah.
And then some of the nuance there is, well, what is the frequency that you do that volume with? If you're doing 15 sets of chest work per week, do you do that all in one day? Do you do it in 2 days, 3 days, 4 days? Does it even matter the frequency that you're doing it? So I think what we really need to do is look at, what does the research say? But research is never really going to tell us where to train. At best, it's going to kind of like shine a flashlight and give us some vague directionality.
Yeah, it's kind of like a guidepost for you.
Yeah, exactly. The way I think about it, have you ever gone like deep water fishing where you have the radar and it tells you roughly where the fish?
Yeah.
The radar doesn't tell you, hey, there's a fish right there. It tells you, hey, in this approximate area, there's a bunch of fish, but you still need to figure out where to cast your line in. Maybe you do or don't get fish, and research works the same way. It's going to give you some vague directionality. Chris is fixing my mic again. Perfect. So it's going to give you some vague directionality, and it's going to tell you what things you probably want to do or what things you shouldn't do. And it's going to give you some ballpark answers, but then it's still up to you as an individual to figure out, well, how exactly do I structure my volume, my frequency? And that's where that N of 1 approach comes, because high intensity for me might not be high intensity for you. High volume for you might be low volume for me. And research can't answer those questions for you.
Yeah. Back in the day, I remember there was kind of like two big schools of thought. It was like, if you want to get big and muscular, then do heavy lifting, like almost powerlifting style. And powerlifters and people who are athletes who are doing powerlifting style training to support their sport would kind of use their muscularity as a justification for those methods. Then there was kind of the bodybuilding community, which was generally in higher rep ranges, say like 10 to 12, or even like there were people that extended that out into like sets of 30 or sets of 40 or sets of 50, which kind of borderlines on like CrossFit training in the original days with like the 300 workouts and stuff like that. And I think you see over time that people can apply those principles, and different people will what is seemingly hypertrophy from different types of methods. And some people will hypertrophy from all of them. Some people just specific ones. You have anything to...
Yeah, and that's where we get into hypertrophy being non-specific, where you could actually have those debates. If we were to have a debate with powerlifting and you're like, hey, I think training with very heavy loads works for powerlifting. And I'm like, hey, for powerlifting, you only want to train with under 30% of your 1 rep max. It's going to be pretty clear which of us is closer to the truth after maybe a month, 6 months, a year. If you're only training with sub 30%, you're probably not going to improve your absolute strength. So that's pretty clear cut.
Yeah.
But with hypertrophy, because so many different things contribute to the growth of muscle, and there are different mechanisms that actually drive hypertrophy, when you have those debates, is it high intensity is what's best for hypertrophy, or is it high volume and lower intensity? The truth is that everyone is right to an extent. So for hypertrophy, it's really more, is the training good enough? And at that point, it really becomes a factor of like logistics. Well, how much volume of this good enough training do we need to do? And how do we need to spread that good enough training out? And what it looks like, just based on some of the like recent meta-analysis, if you're training between about 30 and 90% of a 1 rep max and taking your sets to near failure, on a set per set basis, those sets are going to be equally stimulative for hypertrophy. So if you do a set of leg extensions at 35% of your 1 rep max, God, will you get like, what, 50 reps if you take that to failure?
That sounds like a vomit session.
Yeah, it sounds awful. Versus if you go at 80% of your 1 rep max and you take the set to failure, and maybe you get about 10 reps, on a pure set per set basis, those are going to be roughly equivalent. Where some of the nuance comes from is that 30 to 90% range. It's not perfect. That's doing a average of populations, but for one individual, the range might be 15 to 80% of your 1 rep max would be an effective range for hypertrophy. For another individual, it might be 50 to 95%. So that's where the research is giving us these broad generalities, and we need to apply that for that individual. And then you need to think of things as well, like you just said. Well, 35% of your 1 rep max to failure, you'll probably throw up on yourself before you'll actually reach local muscle failure.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to do 30 work sets per week, how many do you think you're going to do for that muscle group if you're pushing it at 35% of your 1 rep max? You'll just get systemically fatigued before you're getting locally fatigued in the muscle, which is what you would want.
Yeah.
Evan,
And
hold on, Evan, take a half step to your left. There you go. Stay there.
don't move. Yeah. The other thing too about those super high rep sets is you have to take into consideration joint deterioration. So like you're doing leg day twice a week and you're doing, 500 contractions in each one of those sessions, you might not have knees in 10 years.
Yeah, and you also need to consider, is someone even taking that to true local muscle failure?
Yeah.
One of the things that I do whenever I have clients that are like hypertrophy clients, if they are people that use NIRS or Moxy, for all of their major muscle groups, we'll actually test them out in different rep ranges, and I'll give someone like 40% of their 1 rep max on a bicep curl. We'd have to approximate that. We're not testing that. And you'd say, take this to complete failure. And I'll look at the oxygen trends in their muscle and I'll be like, you didn't take the set to failure. And they'll be like, well, it hurt after 25 reps. And it's like, well, guess what?
Failure enough.
Yeah. I mean, you failed. It just wasn't for the right reason. So it's not really going to be that effective. So that's something that you always need to consider as well. If you're giving someone these very, very high rep sets, they're probably going to be uncomfortable and stop before they reach momentary muscle failure, which is really going to be a requirement. Regardless of what load you're using, it just has to suck by virtue of...
Yeah. When I hear about research and research trends and the ranges of percentages that you have to use, it almost seems that the research is non-usable. It's like, all right, well, the rep range is that wide and it's going to be such an individual thing. Then you're really looking at research just to make sure that what you're doing isn't completely stupid. And outside of that, it seems like an individual quest to find what's optimal for each individual.
Yeah, I think to an extent you could say that, because research is going to give us those broad ranges. So obviously we know you probably don't want to train with 20% of your 1 rep max to get hypertrophy. Realistically, is anyone even doing that? Probably not. But it also tells us, well, very, very heavy loads probably aren't going to be the best thing either. So the range that it gives us is kind of a no shit range.
Yeah.
But what it really opens up to is if we think of like traditional training terms, like 0 to 5 reps is absolute strength, 5 to 15 is hypertrophy, 15 plus is local muscle endurance. It gives us the ability to say, well, that's probably not true. If depending on the person, you might do a set where you're failing at 60 or 70 reps, and that would still be hypertrophy. So it just kind of broadens things out. I think where the individualization really comes from with hypertrophy work, and where the literature is actually more useful, is looking at total weekly set volumes per muscle. So tracking volume is the total number of sets done to momentary muscle failure for each muscle group is going to be one of the biggest determining factors for muscle growth. And the research does actually give us a lot of like elucidation there. Like previously, a lot of people thought, well, can't really do more than 10 work sets for a single muscle group before you hit a point of diminishing return. Other people, if you read like Arnold's bodybuilding encyclopedia, he's like, do 50 sets of chest work per week. And you're like, God, how does your pec not tear off the bone? And now the research has given us more practical ranges to work with. But even within that, there's going to be some buffer room for the specific person.
Yeah. And then what about application to sport? And I mean, just use CrossFit because most people listening are probably CrossFitters. And I know a lot of people that want to get bigger, I think because they want to get stronger, but it could just be because they want to look better. I'm not really entirely sure where the like true subconscious desire lies. It can be much more difficult when you then layer in, okay, well, now I'm doing this hypertrophy training, but I'm also trying to get stronger and do all this movement work to make my skills better and doing energy system work. What type of conflict are we going to have when we start to layer in all those adaptations with, even if you said, okay, I did 10 working sets to failure over the course of the weeks on my legs while doing, also while running and doing wall balls and doing all this other stuff?
Yeah, so for a sport like CrossFit, one of the things to keep in mind is a lot of people do say, oh, I want to get bigger, and you'll ask them why, and you'll kind of push them on, and it's typically either, well, I want to look more jacked, which in that case, you're like, well, you could be either the most jacked CrossFitter or you could be the best CrossFitter, and then you might need to decide, hey, maybe gaining muscle really doesn't make sense for you because that's going to be more tissue that you need to ventilate. You're carrying it on all these different movements. But if they do say, well, I need to gain that muscle to get stronger, again, we might have to pressure test that a little bit because that doesn't necessarily hold up. Gaining muscle might not actually make you stronger, or at least it might not to the meaningful degree that people would expect, especially keeping in mind that to really have like a humongous impact on your strength levels, you're going to need to gain a lot of muscle tissue, and that might be detrimental. But then also keeping in mind that because hypertrophy is so non-specific, a lot of the protocols that will get you bigger, not all of them are going to get you stronger. You could train at 40% of your 1 rep max taking those sets to failure. That might not be that advantageous for a back squat or a clean. And on the flip side, there are a lot of methods that will get you stronger and leverage neurological adaptations that might not do shit for muscle growth. So I think it really makes sense to kind of hone in on what adaptation you're trying to get, why you're trying to get it, and then all of these other different variables and things that you need to account for.
Yeah. So it's I think like a good practical takeaway for people to segment or separate the concept in their head of someone muscular or creating a higher degree of muscularity, and that directly influencing strength is not necessarily true. You will see most really strong people are going to be muscular, but then you'll also see people that are world champion weightlifters who are not really that heavily muscled and are in really low weight classes that are deriving strength through just insanely well-developed nervous systems in good positions. And if you put on a bunch of muscle, like let's say in your pecs and your lats, and then you impact your overhead position, you could actually make yourself functionally weaker if the strength metric you're going after is a 1 rep max snatch.
Yeah, and I think another thing to consider too, when we're trying to look at people engaging muscularity and strength levels, there's so many other things that are going to influence strength outside of muscle. It might be the pennation angle that the muscles are inserting at, or
what
it
is
could
that?
be the angle that so if we think about like if your bicep insertion is here and here, it's not all of your muscle fibers are just going straight and inserting from point A and point B. Different muscles have different properties and angles that the muscle fibers are going to insert, and that's going to impact the speed of muscle contraction. That's going to impact the leverage that the muscle has. So in some individuals, they just might not really have good muscle insertions for being really strong and things like that. They're like, oh, well, if I gain more muscle, I'll get stronger. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But you also just might not have the anthropometrics and insertion angles to be as strong as you want to be ever. So
what I had a thought. We were going back and forth earlier in email, and I was thinking about bulk phases back in the day, because that was like super common. And I remember like I would cut weight in wrestling, and then wrestling season would end and I'd be getting ready for football. And then me and all my buddies would be like, oh, it's bulk season. Like you just basically eat as much food as you could possibly put into your face, lift as much as possible. And we all got way bigger, way more muscular. I mean, our environment was probably super well set up for that, being, 17 years old, just going through puberty. But we also got pretty fat. Like we put on a bunch of extra fat. And then when the season started and you did a bunch of conditioning work, you'd lose some of the fat, some of the muscle, and you'd probably be in more of a competitive shape.
Yeah.
I actually found though, that's probably a better, if you're trying to put on muscle or create strength gains quickly, I feel like that hypercaloric state is actually really good to do it. It's just not really necessarily like long-term and sustainable. Whereas if you're trying to optimize aesthetics, you better to be like, all right, I'm going to try to put on half a pound of muscle over the course of the next 3 years per month. And then that would actually be a much better long-term strategy for someone.
Yes, I think some things to consider is, one, depending on where someone's at relative to their natural muscular potential, they might not even need a true caloric surplus to gain muscle. Like people always say you can't gain muscle in a caloric deficit. That's actually not true.
Really?
Yeah. So if you have a low enough training age and you carry some body fat, you could actually continually gain muscle in a deficit. So if someone isn't already relatively lean, they probably don't need a caloric surplus to gain any muscle. They could recomp at that body weight, which would effectively mean if they weigh 200 pounds, they stay 200 pounds, and they gain muscle at that body weight and get leaner. So it's like a recomposition effect.
When you recomposition, this is like a scientific question. You are literally breaking down the fat tissue and then utilizing that energy to synthesize muscle. Not that directly, but kind of.
Yeah, it's kind of fuzzy how the actual like energy transduction behind that works, but essentially that would be the idea that you don't require this huge caloric surplus because you could be in a caloric deficit, and since you're breaking down fat tissue, that could be used for energy.
Okay.
Other things to consider would be something called like a p-value, which is out of all of this weight that you're gaining, how much of it is muscle versus how much of it is fat. If someone has a substantial amount of body fat, they're actually going to partition excess calories towards just making more body fat instead of more muscle. And I'm sure like most 18-year-olds in you guys' training background, like it's probably going to go more towards muscle tissue because we're not talking about guys that are like semi-obese trying to do it. Yeah. But then the last thing is, well, obviously eating a ton of food, it's a really crude way of getting a caloric surplus. So what if we told you like, hey, you guys had an 1,000 calorie surplus, you would have gained just as much muscle on a 150 calorie surplus.
We wouldn't have enjoyed it as much because we were just gluttonous fools.
Yeah.
And that was half the fun, I think.
That's definitely something to consider. But if someone's trying to maximize sport performance, realistically, you really only need about an 100 to an 150 calorie surplus to gain muscle.
Yeah.
I think the reason why someone might practically want to go a little bit higher, maybe closer to 250, 300, is getting an 150 calorie surplus. You could easily wash that out in a single day. Oh, I built up an 150 calorie surplus every day, Monday to Saturday, and then Sunday I skipped a meal and I washed out my entire caloric surplus for the week. So I think practically using like a 250 to 300 calorie surplus, it gives you enough buffer room that you'll probably ensure that you are actually in that surplus and someone won't be gaining excess body fat. Yeah. So that's probably more of a research back range. But then the thing that sucks about that is you can't stuff your face with food and get the enjoyment.
Yeah. So I don't do this anymore, but I have like a story time. So I had a bunch of thyroid damage from like cutting weight and doing fighting stuff. And I think just from mismanagement of diet for a really long time, like probably some of this stuff that we talked about is going on these huge surges of calories and then cutting weight where I was barely eating and going through that for years and years. It just caused some internal hormonal stuff. And I tried to correct it. I was in Utah, so it was probably about 7 years ago. And I remember reading a book by Matt Stone called Eat for Heat. And there was this whole like group of people. You know what I'm talking about?
I don't know, but the name is just great.
Yeah. So the concept was you destroy your thyroid, you destroy your adrenal glands production and all of that stuff. And you're just functionally cold, right? Like your feet get cold all the time, your hands get cold. And so the concept, and there was science to justify the perspectives, that you eat a bunch of saturated fat, sugar, salt, like basically all the things that you would consider unhealthy to stimulate your metabolism to be able to heal your internal hormonal system. So I went through this. I'm like, oh, this is just bulk phase revisited. And I went from 225 to 270 in the course of, I think it was 4 weeks. It might've been 6 weeks. It was just gross.
So that's impressive.
Yeah.
Was the heat, the fucking farts coming out your butthole?
Maybe. Yeah. It was just like, I'd wake up in the morning and have pancakes with peanut butter and maple syrup on top of them and glasses of whole milk with chocolate syrup in them, like literally just as much as I could possibly eat. Ironically, after going through that process and then slowly losing the body fat over the course of 5 years, it actually did heal my hormonal system, but I don't think it was that. But the reason why I told that story is during that period of time, I was really overworked. I wasn't doing that much training, but because I was eating like that, I was way more just calm on a regular basis. Like I just had low energy, so I didn't move as much and I didn't really train as much, but my strength levels went through the roof. Like I front squatted, I think 415 or 425 when my previous PR was like 335 or 345. And I think there is something to just the amount of parasympathetic engagement you get from overfeeding like that allows you to be stronger and bring more energy to strength work, which could almost influence hypertrophy in a good way, even though I would never recommend anyone to do that.
Did you get a gut?
Oh yeah.
Maybe it was your gut pushing against yourself.
It could have just been just pressure. I was going to say, you also
think about, you were already really
Come closer
strong
to your mic, Evan.
when you were training. So if you're doing basically anything, it's fairly easy to maintain muscle mass. You're like, well, maybe you were just wearing a 50-pound weight vest. And you're like, that's enough to maintain your muscle.
Yeah. It's just an interesting anecdote that I thought. And I think that those belief systems about what you need to do, because that was ingrained. I think the concept was, it might've been pumping iron. They talked about after really hard training sessions, going to the diner and eating apple pies and stuff. And I think that whole concept was just built into my psyche at an early age. Like, oh, if bodybuilders are doing this, it has to be right. It couldn't be the drugs.
Pumping iron is just full of scientific wisdom.
Oh man. All right. So that just is a story to explain how stupid I am to everyone else out there and how I experiment with my body. What else do you have on your sheet, on your bullet point list that we got to cover?
Man. Exercise selection is one thing, or tempos. I mean, just the things that people typically think are associated with hypertrophy. Like I grew up, my dad's a bodybuilder, so I grew up around bodybuilding culture.
Closer to the mic.
Closer to the mic. I thought you were saying
it's going to be, you should clip out all of these things and put this up as the 1 minute clip about what this episode is all about.
I mean, we talked a little about hypertrophy, but most of the podcast was just Chris whispering.
Just here. Let's take a pause. Kiss the mic and then move back barely.
Who else has kissed this mic?
No, not really kiss it. Like, here's me.
That's perfect.
Close.
Where you are right now is so perfect.
Okay, fantastic.
Just get intimate with that Rode mic.
Yeah, my smooth radio voice.
KB 101.
But yeah, like growing up learning about bodybuilding, then you get into the training culture. What are the things that you typically hear is hypertrophy training? You train in higher rep ranges, you keep your rest periods really short, and you get like a huge pump. And it turns out when you look at the researches, you're like, oh, that is one of the things that we know isn't actually an effective way to train for hypertrophy. You also hear, oh, you do an exercise with a tempo, and that is more effective for hypertrophy than not. I think that's been pushed largely by Charles Poliquin. That was one of his big things in the CrossFit world. Yeah. James Fitzgerald would talk about that a lot. And you look at the research, that's also probably not accurate. Something like a tempo will change what part of the muscle is hypertrophying, but it's not going to yield more hypertrophy on a set per set basis. So I think there's a lot of nuance in the actual construction of workouts, how you space things out across a workout, how you would go about selecting exercises and selecting tempos, things of that nature.
Yeah, I think as you were talking about that, my first thought was I feel like this whole concept gets very confusing in the marketplace because just one of the most powerful selling forces is social proof. So if somebody is super muscular and is giving advice on how to create muscularity, their opinion is going to be much more easily listened to, and people are going to be more receptive to that than if somebody is like, super skinny and not, and never lifts. Like it's just kind of something that our brains probably latch onto to try to understand people's credibility or recognize contradictions. And the truth, at least with what I've found, the people that I've spent time with who were Division I athletes and who I was in the weight room, it didn't really matter what they did. If you were gifted physically and you had the right internal hormonal system, those people were creating hypertrophy with protocols that you'd probably look at and be like, nah, that wouldn't get you bigger, because they just are naturally physically gifted and built for growth.
And that's another thing that we need to keep in mind as well. At least think about the training landscape, maybe about 10 years ago or so. If you just Googled training information, there isn't anywhere near as much information as available right now. And that wasn't that long ago. And who were the people that did have voices and platforms at that point? Almost all of them were strength and conditioning coaches that worked in like the D1 sector or private sector, worked with professional athletes. And that's where you would find a lot of these hypertrophy protocols that are quote unquote effective.
Yeah.
Well, if you think about the populations that they were using these protocols with, they could more or less do anything.
Yeah.
And they're going to put on muscle. So you give these athletes these protocols, they end up working. Surprise, surprise. Yeah. Well, now these are the effective hypertrophy protocols. But then when you pressure test those against the scientific literature, you see, those probably aren't really the best protocols to use. Two, they also don't work for most people who do them because they're not D1 or professional athletes. Like you look at some of the studies where they look at the average fat-free mass index of a D1 football player. It's like a 26 or a 27, which is just fucking absurd.
Yeah. Yeah, they're just super, super gifted. And I think that creates a lot of problems with people having realistic expectations about what it takes. I've had a ton of people more in my past when I was doing just more fitness training and less CrossFit specific training, where people would come on and they'd be like, I want to put on 10 pounds of muscle. And I'm like, all right, there are some people that can put on 10 pounds of muscle in like the next month or the next 3 months, just an unrealistic time frame. I'm like, there are some people, like if you get a completely untrained teenager that just went through puberty and then starts lifting and they just happen to have great genetics, that can put on that type of muscle. But if you're talking about somebody in their mid-20s with some sort of a training age, having that kind of expectation, I feel like is part of the problem. Like putting on muscle is actually a very difficult thing. And it's a more of a long-term quest where you have to stay disciplined to it over the course of years and years and years if you want to see meaningful change, especially if you want to do it without putting on a lot of body fat.
Yeah, it's definitely like an equation of just effort over time, where there are some of those people, like I've had athletes that are CrossFitters, and we have to actively work to make it that they don't put on muscle, because it ends up just interfering with their CrossFit training.
Yeah.
They're like, hey dude, like if I eat too much for a few weeks, like I just put on tissue and I stay lean, and well, you're probably not the average person.
Yeah.
But for most people, it is very strict and dedicated training, where a lot of CrossFitters will typically think, oh, I'm just going to eat more for the next few weeks and I'll put on the amount of muscle that I want to, but they're also not really doing any training that would increase their muscle mass.
Yeah.
So it becomes a kind of iffy thing when we're talking about putting on muscle, who the individual is, what their other goals are.
So let's take it to CrossFit and say, which type of people would actually benefit from specific hypertrophy protocols in their training that, yes, would make them look better, look them more muscular, but that would also transfer into better performance? Could you even say if there would be people that would fall in that category?
Yeah, it's hard to give an avatar for that, because we need to think about all of their other qualities. Is this person already competitive in all of the other things in the sport? Are their gymnastics sufficient? Are their cyclical metrics sufficient? Are they already good at mixed work? And they are like I had a guy a few years ago that I coached. In the US, he was top 10 in almost every event in the open, but on the strength events, he would literally get like 15,000. Whereas for him, he really just needed to get stronger. And that was literally the only thing that kept him out of regionals or the games. But for most people, that's not going to be the case. So we also need to think about, do they need to get better at endurance work? How much of a priority is strength versus some of these other metrics if we're actually doing the math and stacking them up on a leaderboard? Strength is the easy one for people to always think is the reason why they're not a better CrossFitter.
Yeah.
Because it's so obvious. Oh, I squat 300. This other athlete squats 450 and they're better than me at CrossFit. But that might not actually be why they're a worse CrossFitter. And I mean, obviously we know this, but it's something that's not always abundantly clear.
I feel like we have a question from the peanut gallery.
No?
No. Oh, okay.
Well, I had a totally separate question if y'all are done with that point.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to ask Evan, why is it, because I think we've had this conversation before, some CrossFitters, hypertrophy, just doing
anything.
Regular old CrossFit, some don't. Can you tell us that?
Yeah, so, and this isn't even specific to CrossFit, but if you're an athlete who you've spent years increasing the amount of mitochondrial density in your muscles, doing resistance training, doing speed and power training, and you have poor cardiac development, relatively speaking.
Hold on, can I pause you real quick?
Please do.
Mitochondrial density means basically the energy production cells inside of the muscle, right?
Yeah, so you could almost think about it as like the gross number of mitochondria that you have. Like, what is the actual density of these mitochondria in relation?
How do you
so
get
you produce more of them through training? You can.
Yeah, specific types of training. Yeah.
Okay, so if you have that and then cardiac output, sorry, that was the next point.
If you have a lot of mitochondrial density, you're going to be really good at utilizing oxygen in that muscle tissue. So if we think about how oxygen gets from the environment around us to the working muscle, you're going to breathe in oxygen. And it's going to diffuse into the blood of the alveoli in your lungs. And now your circulatory system, your heart, is going to take that oxygenated blood and it is going to deliver it to the working muscle. And in the working muscle, that oxygenated hemoglobin or that oxygenated blood is going to go through the arteries into the arterioles, and then it's going to cross over the capillary beds in your muscle. Well, if you're someone who's spent a lot of time improving your mitochondrial density, doing a lot of resistance training, and you haven't improved your cardiac output, and you don't have a lot of capillary density in blood vessels because you haven't really done much endurance training.
Yeah.
So if we think of it like this, let's say,
make sure you stay close to the mic.
God.
Okay. So let's say this laptop is the mitochondrial density. So it's a big surface of mitochondria, and this is where oxygen is going to get pulled out of the blood. So this is the artery and the blood's coming through. And now this is my capillary bed. It's very small relative to the amount of mitochondria under it. So the total surface area of oxygenated blood is really small compared to the surface area of these mitochondria. All this oxygenated blood is going to be stripped out of the capillary bed really quickly.
Yeah.
Because it would be like if this is a terrible analogy. You had one pizza getting delivered and there's 50 people under there. It's going to get consumed very quickly.
Yeah.
A similar phenomenon is going to happen. Those athletes are really good at utilizing oxygen in the muscle compared to their ability to deliver oxygen. Where this is going to become an issue is those athletes are also much better at creating tension in the muscle than they are pushing blood through the muscle. So when they're doing a sport like CrossFit, and even if something like wall balls or chest to bars, it's a relatively low amount of tension in the muscle, but that tension is going to be higher than their heart is capable of pushing blood through. And that's going to cause them to get what's called a venous occlusion, which means arterial blood is entering the muscle, but venous blood isn't escaping the muscle and getting back to the heart. When that happens, if you've ever gotten a pump doing a workout, that means arterial blood's entering your muscle and venous blood can't leave. So you're getting this swelling and pooling effect in the muscle. So effectively what happens in some CrossFitters is that they're creating the right environment in the muscle for hypertrophy just by doing mixed work. So someone who has a lot better cardiopulmonary system development and their cardiac output's really good, if they're doing a wall ball, they're probably going to be able to push enough blood through that muscle that they won't get that effect. Someone who can't do that is going to pull all of the oxygen out of their muscle. And when you desaturate oxygen in a muscle, you get something called an oxygen conforming response. So as blood is restricted to a muscle and as oxygen decreases in that muscle, you will get greater and greater motor unit recruitment. And that increase in motor unit recruitment is going to cause mechanical tension to increase. And mechanical tension is the primary driver for hypertrophy. So this kind of opens up a whole Pandora's box of, with CrossFit athletes, getting stronger might actually make you worse at something like CrossFit if you were getting stronger at the expense of being able to get blood into your muscle. This is why you could have an athlete that has a 250-pound back squat do better in a workout like Karen versus someone who has a 500-pound back squat. That athlete that squats 250 pounds, if they have really good cardiac output, they might get steady blood flow during that workout. It almost turns into like a cyclical event where the athlete with the 500-pound back squat, they're creating a lot of tension. They're going to be restricting the ability of blood to get back to their heart, and that's going to lower their cardiac output. So they end up just occluding on that workout, and it looks more like circuit training or hypertrophy training.
Yeah. So long story short, everyone gets a different adaptation from different styles of training. And some people, just by nature of what they've done in the past and but by what their genetics are, can do CrossFit and put on muscle because of what you just explained in terms of how the environment gets created when they start working.
Yeah.
Man, that is insane. It would be nice to be one of those people that just was good at everything at the highest level and never had to think about it. It's like, oh, I just do more training and I'm just better than everybody.
Yeah. That would be nice.
Never have to think about it.
It's great when you coach those athletes too.
Yeah.
So is you were talking about the pump a minute ago. Is that important? Yes, no? If you're trying to grow
for
them.
what?
Like, yeah, for hypertrophy, man.
So,
that's what this podcast
yeah,
is about.
hypertrophy.
Well, we went off topic, so I don't know if he's saying is the pump important for CrossFitters? Like what are...
I think in pumping iron, Arnold said that it's better than an orgasm.
I believe he did say that.
I do remember that.
No, he said it's like coming.
Oh, okay. Thank you for being more
specific. Yeah, I mean, we're all about specificity and scientific accuracy. So, yeah.
You know
so
what that means, right?
Yeah.
you could say it is important for hypertrophy, but that's also not always going to be true. A pump is important so far as a pump really just indicates that you're contracting the muscle hard enough that venous blood isn't getting back to the heart. So in that regard, it would tell you, yeah, you're training with enough intensity that if you take that set to failure, you're going to get hypertrophy. But there's other ways to get a pump. If you just do a ton of sets smashed together with really short rest periods, you might also get a pump, but it might not be for the same reason. It might be because your cardiac output is actually decreasing, so you're no longer able to push blood through that muscle, but you might be lacking significant mechanical tension. So I think a good way to separate those would be if you're taking long enough rest periods between your sets, taking 2-3 minutes between your sets of bicep curls and you're getting a pump on all of those, you could be fairly confident that those sets are going to be effective. But if you're doing 3 sets of bicep curls back to back with 30 seconds rest and you're getting a massive pump, well, those second and third sets might not actually be that effective for hypertrophy because you might be failing for a different reason.
I like that. What else do you have written on your little sheet under this?
Is there any method to the mayhem for figuring out rest periods like you were just talking about? Like, it's not going to be the same for everybody would be my guess.
Yes. I mean, unless you're using any kind of technology, good heuristics would be, does the muscle feel recovered enough right now that you could perform like maybe an 8 out of 10 level of recovery? The pump's gone down in that muscle. It doesn't feel burned or fatigued anymore. And you could execute another set with good quality, good contractions in that muscle. You could get at least 5 to 6 quality reps. Then you're probably recovered enough. But if you finish...
And what if you could do that within 30 seconds? Does that mean weight was too light?
Great recovery system.
Yes, you just have phenomenal recovery. I just haven't actually seen that in anyone.
This made me... were you finished answering his question?
I think so.
Okay. This whole little secondary conversation and questioning made me think about how many people do post-workout burnout sets to like, and it's literally for the concept for it is to get bigger. Like I've seen a bunch of people that will do like 2 sets of 75 band tricep extensions to try to get their arms more jacked. So are you saying, and I would imagine most of those people are not getting more jacked from doing that anyway, but
hypothetically, let's say they did get more jacked from that. Another thing to keep in mind though, is that on a set per set basis, whether you're training at 30 or 90% of your 1 rep max, those are equivalent. Most of the time when people do that, they're like, this 70 rep set of band pull parts, or I feel like I'm going to throw up after, that's going to drive hypertrophy. Guess what? That was no more effective than your set of 8 that you did to failure on a set per set basis. So practically
take heavier bands and just do them to less reps.
Yeah. And do more sets. Like in the amount of time that you could have just done that 75 rep set and you're completely fucked up after, for much less effort, you could have done 3 sets, 15 to 20 reps with sufficient rest, and you would have actually gotten more muscle growth.
And it would be maybe more enjoyable too, or like less painful.
More enjoyable. And I think like you think about traditional bodybuilding, there is that like masochism component to it. But when you look at the science, those are the types of things that you think about and you're like, man, that's an easy adjustment to someone's program. That's one of the things that I love. Like when I do consulting with someone and their goal is hypertrophy and I look at their program, it's like these little tweaks here and there that you could have them make, adjust your rest periods a little bit, structure your execution on the sets differently. Instead of doing your 100 rep set of bicep curls that makes you want to die at the end of your workout, do 3 different sets with sufficient rest. It's not going to be as fatiguing, not as much joint stress, and it's actually more effective. So it's a lot of things like that that we need to think about.
Okay. I have one more question, and then I'd like to give some practical takeaways for people that are listening to this that do want to get jacked. First, or the last question is, how about, let's call it just cardio or cyclical work as a influencer to, because I know that's, if you just look at what most people did from an empirical basis in bodybuilding as a culture, it'd be a bunch of resistance training. And I think it would be segmented into the people that were either doing heavy or moderate to light weights at really high reps with short rest, and then very low intensity cardio. And I'm assuming most of that is for fat burning, but in the CrossFit world, the cardio is done at a little bit of a higher intensity. So people are on like interval programs where they're in like middle range endurance. How much of a negative influence will that have on somebody's ability to try to put on muscle from a research basis?
So that technically, if you look at the pure research, most people could get away with like 1 to 2 good sessions of like endurance training per week without it having a negative impact on muscle growth. Keep in mind that's an average. So some people could maybe get away with 3, 4, 5. Other people maybe 0 to 1. But then when we're talking about the specific type of training you're doing, we need to keep in mind like how much more stressful is it for you to do a Metcon than it is to go hop on a bike for 30 minutes at a low intensity. We need to keep in mind other considerations, like if you're doing that high intensity work, will that actually limit the total volume that you can do of hypertrophy work, which is going to be one of the most important things. So it's like little things like that.
Okay. So another individualization that is the only way to find out for yourself. All right. So practical takeaways that could be applied to all individuals. Do you have any that you could give people? Like my thoughts would be, one, you have to be in a caloric surplus unless you're a real beginner.
Yeah. Another would be 2 parts. You have to train with enough intensity and taking your sets to a close enough proximity to failure for your sets
Speaking
to actually...
of close proximity.
God. For your sets to actually matter. But then outside of that is if someone is the classic hard gainer and they're like, I can't gain muscle. So it's are you actually executing your sets properly? Yeah. Are you taking them to true failure and not like, oh, I failed? Or like, are you going to drop the bar on yourself if you try and do it another 1 or 2 times? And then outside of that, what a lot of the research shows is that there's really no such thing as a non-responder for hypertrophy training. It's that you're probably not doing enough volume. Traditionally, people would say if you can't gain muscle, do less volume and do less total work. And it's actually the opposite. If you're a non-responder, do more total volume. A lot of times when I've talked to people and they're like, hey, I can't gain muscle, and I look at their program, I'm like, dude, you're doing 3 sets of delt work per week, or you're doing 5 sets of biceps 2 different days of the week. I'm like, that's 10 total work sets. Someone who's solely doing hypertrophy training might be doing 30 sets of bicep work per week, 25 sets of chest work per week, 30 sets of back work. So
yeah, you're talking about specific hypertrophic volume.
Yeah. And if we're talking about a CrossFitter that can't gain muscle, well, they might actually require 20 sets of chest work per week to gain muscle at a meaningful enough rate for them to really notice it, but they might not be able to do that while also doing CrossFit training. So it opens up these other considerations like, hey, if you're someone who tends to not respond really well, could you even do the type of training you would need to do to get muscle growth while doing CrossFit? The answer might be no, you can't do that. So you need to either pick which one of those goals you want to go after.
Yeah, that was going to be my next point, was you need to be very specific about your goal prioritization. I've talked to so many people, and I don't know if it's that people are consciously full of shit when they're talking to you, or that they're unconsciously aware of the fact that they would much rather like the way they look than perform at the level that they say is their goal. Like, for example, I want to make a sanctional, or I want to make a regional as an individual. If you really gave that person the opportunity in a one, like, hey, no work required, you either make the CrossFit Games as an individual or look in the mirror and love your muscularity in the way that you look. I think a lot of people would say that they wanted the games, but if push came to shove on that offer, would take the body composition. And I think if you have that type of a thing inside of you, you should structure your training appropriately to honor yourself and give yourself training and a nutritional profile that's going to give you that goal, instead of focusing on a sport performance goal that maybe might not satisfy you.
Yeah, I found a lot of times I'll have those conversations, and you could have them with people on an initial client call, and people don't really tell you their real goals when you first talk to them. So I'm almost always like, okay, we'll keep this a little open-ended.
Yeah.
And a lot of athletes will say, my goal is only to be a competitive CrossFitter. I want to make sanctionals. But then as you start working with them, they're like, hey coach, could I add a few sets of tricep extensions and delt work, like a few days a week to my training? And we start to go through that process, and you eventually get to a point where you're like, is your goal to be a sanctional athlete because you think you will look a certain way if you do enough volume to be a sanctional level athlete? Or is your goal just to look that way and you actually don't even care about making sanctionals? And I've had a meaningful amount of athletes that I've coached where we finally boil it down to, you don't actually care about CrossFit and competing. You just thought that being a sanctional level competitor would make you look like one.
Yeah.
And you don't have to track your diet and you don't have to track your training. You just train hard and eat a bunch and you're going to look like Noah Olson. And the reality is
doesn't work
Noah
like
Olson looks like Noah Olson.
Yeah.
And for most people, they probably actually need dedicated hypertrophy work and to control their diets if they want to look that way. So I think it's just important to be honest. What do you actually want to accomplish with your training? And it's okay if your goal is just to look fucking jacked. Like, just wanting to be as strong as possible is also very vain, but people don't typically see it that way.
Yeah, for sure.
Can we draw this out? And can you give, I know you hate doing this, but could you give like a generic one size fits most template of like, if they were wanting to get into hypertrophy work and they weren't a super beginner, they've been doing something for a while and now they want to, like, what are some of the guidelines you would say?
I mean, if we were to go super broad, because you also need to consider like someone's biceps might need 30 sets a week and their delts might need 15. But if we were to say on like,
what's a good starting point where then you would then figure it out?
Start with 10 to 14 sets for each muscle group, somewhere in the 6 to 25 rep range with each set taken to failure. Space that out for each muscle group with probably 2 sessions per week. Rinse and repeat until
yeah. And I think going along that lines, if you are somebody who is naturally quite strong and knows that they put on muscle quasi easily and also gets very sore from workouts, doing reps of 25 to failure for 10 to 15 working sets a week is going to be a lot to handle and probably not where I would start. I'd start on the heavier range and build your volume over time. Just as that's not a one size fits all, but that's how you would take that one size fits all and maybe give yourself some guidelines. There are some people that are just built for volume and some people who are built as much more intense humans, and that can kind of dictate where you would fall in those rep ranges.
Yeah. And that would be a good thing to mention too. Like what you're saying would particularly be something I'd consider if they're doing this training in a CrossFit gym where they probably don't have the best equipment selection for hypertrophy training. So if they're primarily using things like barbell and dumbbell pressing work, like barbell rowing, deadlifting, back squatting, you probably should err on that lower volume end, because if you're taking sets of squats and deadlifts to failure,
they're compound.
Yeah, where I was primarily thinking you're in a commercial gym and you could just put yourself on a preacher curl bench and you're probably not going to create that much damage, or you could use a leg extension. But 10 sets of squats to failure is completely different than 10 sets of leg extensions.
We didn't really go into that when we talked about exercise selection.
No.
I think that would be one of the big keys is if you truly want to get into hypertrophy training, I think it makes sense, even if you are an enthusiast about CrossFit, is think about figuring out a way to step away from some of your CrossFit training, lower your Metcons so that they don't conflict, maybe turn some of them into EMOMs, like 2 days a week, do an EMOM where you just take, all right, these are the 10 most important skills that I need to hit in the sport. I'm just going to do a 20-minute EMOM and alternate movements for 10 straight minutes and do 2 sets of those each. And bam, that's my CrossFit training for the week, and truly dedicate your training to making the proper exercise selection and rep ranges, which I think really does oftentimes require going to a commercial gym and using cables and pulleys and different lines of action so that that way you can actually get more training volume. You have to be a very advanced trainee to have a ton of exercise selection options when it comes to dumbbells, kettlebells, barbells. Most people just don't know that and don't really know where they could get the exercise selection variation that they would need to really prevent themselves from doing like overload on a specific joint.
Yeah. And I think another thing that people don't consider is like resistance profiles.
Pull the mic down a little bit.
What range is this muscle actually being loaded? Like a lot of barbell or dumbbell movements actually don't really have great resistance profiles for stimulating a muscle. Another thing that people don't consider is you pop yourself on a machine and it puts your skeleton in the right position for that movement. Where if you say like to a CrossFitter, do a lateral raise, CrossFitters are really good at finding the easiest way to do a movement and making it really efficient. The easiest way to do a lateral raise, throw your chest up and do a lateral raise. You put yourself into thoracic extension, you're not going to get good delt recruitment. So you might have a CrossFitter and you're like, God, I'm giving this guy 15 sets of delt work per week and nothing's happening. you snag a video and you're like, oh, it's because you're not using your delts on any of these sets of delt work. And the same thing could apply for something like a back squat. People are really good at finding an efficient way to squat heavy, but the stance, the way they set up for their squat for hypertrophy training, if they actually want to try and isolate their quads, might be very different than when they're back squatting for maximal load. And if someone's really advanced, they could kind of parse these things out themselves. But a lot of times athletes don't really make these considerations, so they don't really know if their training's working or not, because they can't accurately say, I was doing 15 sets for this muscle group per week and all of my sets were actually targeting this muscle. So it kind of creates a impossible way to even track their training volume.
Yeah. All right. So that was a very long-winded answer to your general template question that went into a different tangent. You got any other questions to ask as we wrap it up?
No, but one thing I'm thinking now is there's so much meat on the bone with this topic that I'm sure we'll do another episode. So I'm thinking, how about if you're listening to this episode, or if you're on the audio, go to the YouTube version and leave a comment, and we'll maybe circle back here soon and do a second episode where we answer anything you feel like we missed, because we certainly didn't cover even close to everything.
I mean, I think it'd be cool to do, and I think it would be cool. I'd really like to know with the audience, but if we broke down a couple sample programs of like, here's somebody doing something, or go through a Moxie evaluation on what's happening with people doing a set of bicep curls to failure at different weights, and just kind of take a look at how different athlete profiles might respond. I think there's a lot of stuff that we could go into here.
Are you doing a classroom series on that?
Eventually.
Not yet?
Yeah, I don't have
so
that.
So maybe if you're listening this way in the future, there might be one?
Yeah.
Word.
All right, everybody. Hopefully you can figure out how to get yourself jacked. Thanks for listening. Also, before we end, I think there's something on your cheek that I left there the whole time, hoping that the YouTube video would catch it.
Oh, okay.
Which cheek?
It's a cut.
Oh, it's a cut. All right. Makes more sense.
The cheek that's facing me?
No, the other one.
But that's not, how's that? That's not even.
Yeah, sound facing.
The cameras are pointing this way.
Oh, yeah. All right. Fair enough.
The,
it wouldn't have been seen anyway.
Somewhere up there.
All right. See you guys.
Peace.